We're back with even more info on Final Fantasy VII Revelation from the game's director Naoki Hamaguchi, where this time he talks about the game's level cap, will Cloud and Sephiroth team up again, and how they're handling the endgame content, which sounds incredibly intriguing. So if any of that sounds cool to you and you are super hyped for Final Fantasy VII Revelation, go ahead and hit that like button with a braver to show it you mean business. So as always, I will leave links in the description down below to every article that we feature in today's video, so you can go to the websites and read the full interviews with Hamaguchi for yourself. But we start off first with Gabriel Lorino of everyeye.it, where they go on to ask Hamaguchi about the weapons. How will they be integrated? Will they be part of the main story or optional super bosses? Hamaguchi goes on to say, in this aspect, I wanted to pay homage to the original game and keep the same structure. So yes, some weapons will be encountered and fought during the main story. Others, however, you'll see in certain regions or areas of the world map and can only fight them as optional content. They'll also have their own narrative component. Yes, some will be part of the main story, while others will be optional content. I think one of the differences between Revelation and Remake/Rebirth is that the first two were designed to encourage players to replay the entire adventure on hard mode after completing it. Revelation will be different. It will feature a lot of endgame content, unlike Remake and Rebirth. To give a concrete example, yes, there will be weapons and enemies even tougher than the final boss you face in the story. Examples include the weapons themselves or the beloved Knights of the Round. Instead of pushing the player to restart the game on hard mode, Revelation will encourage them to complete all the remaining content on the world map after finishing the main story. Another thing I wanted to add is that in Remake and Rebirth there was a level cap, but in Revelation we will not have a level limit. Players will be able to reach level 99. So obviously, there's a lot to go off of there. When it comes to the weapons, it's pretty self-explanatory. I think they're structuring the weapon encounters in Revelation much like they were in the original. So Diamond Weapon, Ultimate Weapon / Ultima Weapon will be part of the main story. Diamond Weapon makes a beeline to Midgar, so you gotta stop it there. And then you've got Ultima Weapon flying around like an a-hole, which means Ruby, Emerald will be optional probably. And then there's the big question mark of Sapphire.
Sapphire, guys!
They actually do put some focus on Sapphire in the marketing so far. There's the section where it doesn't get killed at Junon by the Sister Ray. Some eagle-eyed viewers did notice that some of the fins did get shot off, so it is slightly damaged, but it doesn't seemingly die there. It gets it shot off, and for all we know, it could just be floating around in the ocean as another optional side boss. So they may have decided to save Sapphire and keep it as an optional boss instead of just having it get taken out in a cutscene in the main story. So that's a pretty big question mark. But even though those weapons, Ruby, Emerald, potentially Sapphire, will be probably optional, I'm sure they'll still include some backstory and lore to keep them really interesting and intriguing. The other big question mark is Omega Weapon. Hamaguchi has said that their big goal with this remake series is to take all things Final Fantasy VII from the original game to the compilation to the spin-offs and put them all in one cohesive story, which means Dirge of Cerberus, which would also potentially mean Omega Weapon. So the purpose of all of these weapons are technically different. The aforementioned weapons, Diamond, Ultima, Sapphire, Ruby, Emerald, their whole goal is to protect the planet. Omega's goal is to protect the life stream. So if it senses that the planet's in danger and there's no saving it, it will take the life stream and make a beeline for space to find a new host. So if we're dealing with some world-ending threats in this game that seem really dire, I could see an Omega Weapon potentially showing up as a surprise super boss, which could be pretty cool. And as far as doing all of this stuff post-game, I think you could probably still tackle it before you finish the main game. That's the kind of person I am. I like to do everything I can on the world map and then go towards the end and finish the game and have this finite actual finale where I feel like there's closure there. So I don't know if they're going to lock some of that stuff for post-game or if it's just going to be all there and you decide how you want to approach it. The level cap also makes sense. This is the finale. Let the players go all out, level themselves up to 99 maximum. This is the end. But I think the bigger thing here from this quote is Hamaguchi saying that they're not going to push the player to restart the game on hard mode. because that was one of the like key features of Remake and Rebirth was, okay, you finished the game, now play through again on hard mode. It's going to be a little different. It's going to be more difficult. Based on what Hamaguchi's saying, it kind of sounds like maybe there won't be a hard mode, and maybe there won't be a need for one, because with this game being structured way more like the original FF7 and older Final Fantasies, where instead of just playing on a set difficulty, you're essentially going to have varying levels of difficulty throughout the world map. Now, when it comes to the story stuff, that will escalate in terms of difficulty until you get to the very end, but the side stuff, all of the different locations will have different levels of difficulty, which is how the old games were. Some areas had lower level enemies, other areas had those optional super bosses, some areas had really high level enemies. So maybe that's their approach with Revelation. Maybe they figured because it's an open world exploration game, there's no need for a set difficulty anymore. You can just kind of tune the difficulty for each enemy, boss, and super boss to your liking, which is how it was in the original, which I think I would prefer. Although I really enjoyed hard mode on Remake and Rebirth because it really forces you to use the combat system properly. You really have to look at your materia and equipment setup and your character formations and really figure out what's going to work best against each enemy. It ends up being a ton of fun, and it got to the point where I got so used to hard mode that I couldn't go back and play on the normal difficulty because it just felt way too easy. You can waste bosses really easy in Rebirth specifically, not the VR bosses. Those are brutal, but like the side optional bosses, those are pretty easy to get through. So either they're doing away with that, or maybe it could lead to something like a proper New Game Plus mode, where you start the next game and every enemy now gets a little tougher. The bosses get a little tougher. You can get stronger. That would be pretty cool. And maybe it could reach a point to where you could have a New Game Plus 2, New Game Plus 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way until, it reaches maximum level and you can't fight enemies anymore because it's just too difficult. I believe Clair Obscur did something kind of similar. Now, I didn't do a second playthrough of Clair Obscur, a New Game Plus run. For those of you who did play it, you'll have to let me know in the comments, does the game get harder with each New Game Plus run? I think it probably does, but maybe that's the approach they'll take with Revelation. So all this stuff is changing. We don't know if there will be a hard mode. Based on how they're structuring it, it doesn't really seem to make sense for there to be one. Up next, we jump over to Bloomberg, where Jason Schreier got to interview Hamaguchi, and he asks him, were there any big technical difficulties you had while making Revelation? And these I will summarize, but Hamaguchi essentially talks about the high wind and how one of his big things was that he wanted a looping world, meaning he wanted the player to be able to fly the high wind in any direction and not hit an invisible wall and be forced to turn back, because it kind of really breaks the player immersion, and that's not really fun. So he's like, team, we gotta do looping. And the engineers were fully against it, primarily just because of how difficult it was going to be. And they even questioned, is this really gonna be worth the resources to actually implement this? But they were able to do it, because for Hamaguchi, that was a non-negotiable. So I really appreciate that. That was one of the little things from the original Final Fantasy games that I really loved, where if I, went too far on the map, I didn't have to turn around. I could just keep going straight and it would loop back around and I could go back to where I needed to go. So he's a fan. Everyone working on this game is a fan. So they want to try and have this experience, I think, be like a modernized, updated version of everything we got in the original game, which is a lot of fun. And I imagine that is incredibly difficult, because when you look at open world games, a lot of times there's not just one map that's being used. There's two, maybe sometimes three different maps depending on the game. You look at a game like Horizon Forbidden West. The map that you're using when you're running around as Aloy is different from the map that you're probably seeing when you're up in the sky using a flying mount. So when you're up in the sky, the game doesn't have to prioritize a ton of enemies or NPCs or high quality textures. You might see some stuff from the sky, like some bigger enemies, but there's some low res, low poly looking enemies. And then once you get further into, the world and on the ground, that's when it loads in that highly detailed map full of life, NPCs, enemies, all that stuff. So I imagine for Revelation, you've already got a high quality, high LOD world, and now you're telling the engineers, okay, I'm gonna need you guys to find a way to get this looping to work so we can just load in the map instantly if the player goes too far. That had to have been a nightmare, but clearly they figured it out. found a way to do it, and that's just super impressive. And that's not even taking into consideration jumping off of the high wind into a map, which that's probably more like a Horizon situation where you have like the lower quality stuff, and then the moment you approach the ground, maybe there's like some hidden loading there, and then you get into the proper high quality map. It's pretty fascinating to learn about all this stuff. Up next, Jason reminds Hamaguchi that the last time they spoke, Hamaguchi said that 95% of Rebirth's team moved over to Revelation, which is one of the reasons why this game is coming out as fast as it has, and that's something that maybe Hamaguchi and the Square Enix team should probably look at moving forward. So Hamaguchi goes on to say, I have an incredible amount of respect for all my team members. I'd very much love to leverage the know-how and insights we've gained from working on the 7 Remake series. But when we think of it from a bigger perspective, the company, Square Enix as a whole, I do have to be mindful. Thankfully, the company puts a lot of trust into me and Naoki Yoshida. But if we were to have all the resources in my team and Yoshida's team, that staggers and hinders the growth of the company and the development team members as a whole. I do want to be mindful of that and give different opportunities to the talented development members that we have in our company. Personally, I would love to work with my team again for the next project, but we'll see how it turns out. So like Hamaguchi says, that's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, when you have a team that's moved from project to project to project with one another, which is very rare, especially within Square Enix, normally a team makes a game and then they disband and they're placed wherever they're needed. But because this was an ongoing trilogy, you kind of needed most of the people from the beginning to see it through to the end, which is why this game has come out as fast as it's going to come out. You have people that know their roles, they know how to communicate, they know what they're doing, so they can work as a pretty cohesive team, which is something that Square Enix has, definitely needed to look into because they've had a history of taking quite some time to release their games, sometimes 7-year gaps in between these Final Fantasy releases. So realistically, you could have someone enter high school, graduate high school, enter college, potentially graduate college, and in that space of time, they would have one Final Fantasy game that released, which is bonkers. Looking at the 7 Remake series, from 2020 from the game's first release with Remake to 2027 with Revelation, that's a 7-year gap. In that 7-year gap, they've released technically 4 games, the Remake series and Final Fantasy XVI, so they're seemingly finding ways to kind of maybe fine-tune it for the future. But I can see what Hamaguchi's saying here. If you hog all the good talent, that kind of hinders the rest of the company, and that also might not give other talented developers a chance to shine and give their input. So that's something they'll have to look into, and maybe they're kind of figuring out how to handle that, because you got Yoshi P's team doing Final Fantasy XIV, you've got Hamaguchi and CS1 handling the Remake series, you've got Nomura and his team working on Kingdom Hearts 4, and you've got a team that is working on Final Fantasy Resonance. So maybe they could find a way to structure it out where they have majority of their people stay together, but they're malleable enough to jump to another project if needed. Up next, we move over to some summaries from Audrey from the event in Shanghai, China, where they opened up a brand new Square Enix store, and you got to meet a whole bunch of Final Fantasy VII fans. And this question in particular has to do with Cloud and Sephiroth teaming up. Will we see that again in Revelation? Hamaguchi goes on to say, that is quite a difficult question. I unfortunately can't really speak much on the story at the moment, but what I can say is that since this is indeed the conclusion of the Remake series, how Cloud and Sephiroth will be portrayed, it will probably go beyond your expectations, so please let your imagination run wild for now. The interviewer then proceeds to hype up the crap out of the crowd by saying, "Do you guys think they'll team up and fight together?" The crowd responds with, "Yes, of course." Hamaguchi then says, "I see." And I imagine that he's just stroking his chin as he says that, which is pretty funny. So will Cloud and Sephiroth team up together again in Revelation? Probably. Long story short, if we're dealing with a post-Advent Children Sephiroth who has gone back in time or found a new world, he's clearly aware of the events of the original FF7, Advent Children, and probably even Dirge, which means that he's essentially playing chess this time around. He knows who his pawns are, he knows where he needs to move them and when in order to position himself the best spot possible to win. Which is why he's showing up so much more early in a lot of the story stuff, places he didn't show up in the original. which is part of the new mystery of what Sephiroth is. Before it was, who is this guy? Now it's, what does he want? And throughout the story of the remake series, we've seen him kind of play good cop, bad cop with Cloud. At times, antagonizing him, being a really big bully. At other times, really kind of trying to seduce Cloud to his side of like, hey, yeah, like work with me, man. Let us defy destiny together. We're not Destiny's bitches. We can do this together. And he spent a lot of time trying to sow seeds of doubt with Cloud and Tifa and a lot of other party members. And then there's the appearance of Jareth at the end of Rebirth, Jenova Aerith, who could potentially break Cloud down even more and make him even crazier. Why do all of that? Well, a lot of us have been thinking within the community that Sephiroth's ultimate goal could be that he wants a world where nobody dies, but it's a world where he's still in charge, he's pulling the strings. And when you're the big guy on campus, you don't want anyone else there to try and take your power or tell you what to do.
Yo, Mickey Park's got one hoe and one hoe only, and that's Mickey Park, fool.
And who in the story of FF7 would want to be at Sephiroth's side potentially? Jenova. So Sephiroth would need potentially someone like a Cloud to fully eradicate Jenova, take her power, and then have his dreams and wishes come true. Now, how does he do that? Again, he's been breaking Cloud down pretty severely throughout Remake and Rebirth. He's even had moments where he seemingly possesses Cloud, which ends up causing a ton of chaos. So what if this time around, Sephiroth's goal is to get Cloud to break, but not to the point where he's just comatose and he ends up in Midgar, but to the point where he has no willpower anymore. His will is now Sephiroth's will, meaning Sephiroth would have full control over Cloud, i.e., getting him to potentially help eradicate Jenova. So it could be the type of Cloud we saw in Rebirth where Sephiroth possesses him. Maybe it's just a much darker, broken version of Cloud that is being heavily influenced by Sephiroth. We don't really know. And that's the cool thing about the stories. We don't know what the heck is going on. But they do plan to reveal Sephiroth's actual intentions in Revelation. So we'll figure out who he is, what he wants, how he's doing what he's doing, hopefully, which should be very cathartic. So we could see them team up again. Again, it might be like a darker version of Cloud who's helping Sephiroth. It could be a Cloud that thinks he's helping Sephiroth do something good and eradicating Jenova. We don't know. But the possibility of fighting a dark Cloud could be pretty cool. And to end the video, we jump over to Polygon, where Giovanni Colantonio talked to Hamaguchi specifically about what it's going to be like returning to Midgar in Revelation. So Hamaguchi says, the game experience of visiting and exploring Midgar is going to be a little different than it was in 7 Remake. You won't be able to visit all of the slums or all of the streets you were able to go around in. It's going to be a bit different in Revelation. I can't dive into details too much because it would be a spoiler, but when you look at the overall area of Midgar, it is built in a way that retains the iconic element of the Final Fantasy VII world. Which makes sense. Again, they're really trying to structure out Revelation much like the original game. It's an homage, as Hamaguchi says. So I would expect the return to Midgar, the assault on Midgar, to be mostly linear, probably still having some side content here and there. Again, Weiss is back in the Shinra building. We don't know what's going to happen to Nero by the time we get back to Midgar. We could probably take him out in Wutai. Maybe he escapes and heads back to Midgar. So I could see it being very linear with some of those side things that you can do if you want, but the main goal is to go back, you fight the Proud Claude, and then you take out Hojo. So it'll be interesting to see how they flesh that out. I don't think I need all of Midgar accessible when we go back, especially since, you know, Sector 7's plate collapsed, but it would be nice to revisit some of those slum areas. So I'm curious to see what's locked off, what's still available, what looks different, and what side content gets loaded into that area. So with that being said, that's the video. I am Curious Corduroy. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys thought about what we covered in today's video. Specifically, I would like the focus to be on what you think they're gonna do with the Endgame content, with Hamaguchi kind of talking about how there may not be a hard mode. They kind of just want varying levels of difficulty. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below on that quote from Hamaguchi. I think it's super interesting. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.